Good afternoon to everyone in Singapore, and good day to everyone across the world. This is Sunny, and I have Simon with me, and we are ready to kick off the part 5 of Design and Deploy of vROps webinar series 2016. And as you can see on the slide deck, we'll be talking about design and deployment considerations today. Just a quick background on why we chose this topic. Both Simon and me so far have been talking about the product features and use cases and how you use the product from end user standpoint, but we also want to make sure that from an architect standpoint, from a standpoint of somebody who's designing the infrastructure for running vROps, we could share some of our experience and also learn about various different use cases from people who are joining the call, and probably answer some of those use cases or learn new things as we go forward. So that's why we chose, or we talked about having a design and deployment consideration webinar for vRealize Operations Manager. There are other parts to it around some of the questionable areas or some of the gray areas where you might have questions or concerns. We'll touch upon those, and that'll mostly be done by Simon today, while I will pitch in as we go forward. So Simon, over to you.
Okay, just a couple of housekeeping items. So while we've got the Q&A at the end of the session, assuming we've got enough time, if you do have a question as we go along, please sort of raise your hand or message Sunny, and we'll try and field the questions as we go along. We are recording it, so we will post a link up to the recording in the next couple of days. As Sunny already said, as you're joining, everybody arrives on mute, so that's quite normal. So please use the chat window if possible. Technical issues, ping Sunny. And if you've got any feedback for us, you can reach out to both of us on Twitter or via email. My name is Simon Eady. I work for a company called Extrovert. They're a consultancy primarily doing VMware. I'm a senior consultant, been there a couple of years now, and my specialty is vROps, funny enough. I'll hand over to my colleague, Sunny, to let you know what he gets up to.
Yep, my name is Sunny Dua. I work for VMware. My specialty was never vROps, but yeah, I was suddenly pulled into it, and now I enjoy working on it. Thanks, Simon. Go ahead.
Okay. All right, so what are we going to cover today? So we're going to cover the key components of vROps, identify those and why they're important. We're going to talk about why sizing matters, the maximums, and the node placement. The big questions around high availability, should you or shouldn't you, and the pros and cons for that. We'll talk about clustering and how that works in vROps and the things that you need to bear in mind when you're going to have a vROps cluster. We'll talk about, what if you deploy it wrong, and what if you get the sizing wrong? No one's perfect. You're going to make mistakes. We'll have a quick look at remote collectors, why they are really cool, how they can benefit you and your environment. We'll also discuss disaster recovery and backup, and the best approaches, most importantly, what is supported and what is not. And of course, we'll talk about how everybody's environment is unique. So while what we will discuss today will be very much straight down the middle of the road about what's supported and how to tackle different environments, we do understand that everybody's workplace and environment is different. So we'll try and cover that, and then we'll have some Q&A at the end. But again, if you've got any questions as we're going along, just raise your hand using the WebEx tool, or send a message to Sunny, and we'll try and field your question as we go along. Okay, so what should you be considering? So where am I starting from here? So you're going to deploy vROps. I'm not taking into account that you already have vCops. This is just purely from the ground up. You need to think about how much growth you're expecting. And by that, I mean the size of your environment. Is it currently, do you have 1,000 VMs and you're going to go to 1,500 VMs, or have you got 20 VMs and you're going to go to 1,000 VMs? Those kinds of things, number of hosts, number of VMs, number of objects which you're going to monitor. An object is typically a virtual machine or a network switch, something that's an entity that you can quantify in that respect. The difference between an object and a metric is a VM will have lots of metrics like CPU, RAM, that kind of thing, or a switch will have, input-output thresholds, data stores, or storage will have I/O. So that's a clear differentiator. So future growth, very important. You need to consider that in your design when you're thinking of deploying vROps for the first time. You need to think about remote sites. Do you have remote sites? So if you have a main site and lots of remote sites, or do you have a small central site and lots of satellite sites? Or are you based in a small site, but all of your remote sites are large sites? All these things you need to factor in. You need to think about management packs. Now, management packs, if you're not familiar with them, are provided either by VMware or Blue Medora or a vendor. So it could be provided by Cisco to monitor UCS, for instance, or it could be Brocade or any other number of things. There aren't management packs for everything, but there's a heck of a lot available on the Solutions Exchange. So if you have equipment on site or in various sites that you want to monitor, have a check of the management packs, have a read through the documentation, and be aware of the constraints of those. So if you're planning on monitoring a product and there isn't a management pack for it, or perhaps there isn't an up-to-date management pack, that's something you need to take into consideration. Also, you need to think about what other sources you're going to be pulling in and pushing in. It could be that you're going to be doing integration with something like LogInsight or Hyperic, for instance. They're all a part of the operations management suite from VMware. So all of these things contribute to the scale and the size of your vROps deployment. So try to factor in all of these different bits and pieces, and you'll see why in a moment. Another thing to consider, should you be using the virtual appliance, which is normal, that's sort of atypical of what people mostly go for. But VMware have given you the option of deploying onto Windows or Linux. Should you use remote collectors? Well, this ties back to remote sites, or, as you'll see, using them for some offload or on a local site, so you can have local remote collectors. And then also, what are your backups? How are you going to back it up? Those are things that you should definitely be considering. So that's just some, off the top of my head, things that we should be considering. Sonny, have you got anything to add to that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, because when you go through that list, right, there's so many things in that list where you will really think hard and you'll come out with something. And trust me, whatever you come out with would not be the exact number which you will look at in the future. Because what I've seen and how I've seen the virtual infrastructures grow and not only grow from a perspective of number of objects or metrics, but also from a perspective of integrations with various different ecosystem products, that you are basically definitely landing into a situation where you will bring in new objects from third-party management packs, as Simon just mentioned. So with your future growth, I will always ask you to put buffer. And that buffer is something which will save you from such situations. I'm not saying that you can't scale out later on, and we'll talk about those considerations, but it's always good to know where you want to go before you start walking. That's the idea behind it.
Yeah, absolutely. Try not to, that's good advice. Try to avoid going too small or thinking, I might be able to get away with it. You don't want to be in the position where you knowingly undersized your environment. This is a tip from the field right now. Things will not go well for you if you undersize your vROps cluster or nodes.
Yep. And I think there's a great point which Carl mentioned. So Carl is our staff TAM at VMware, and he's been kind enough to join this session at 11 p.m. his time. But Carl mentions that on the chat to me that number of users to access vROps, and that's the biggest one, I believe, right? And how many users can access, and we will touch upon that, and Carl knows that we will touch upon that as well. But yeah, that's one of the bigger consideration as well, especially thinking about the fact that your operations will come and log into vROps day in, day out. So yeah, that's a good one.
Excellent.
As
well. Okay, we'll move forward then. So key components. Yep. So how is vROps made up of, or what is it made up of? So if you're going to be deploying, the very first node you deploy is a master node. I'm not going to read this out, guys, so and remember the recording is available later. The master node is exactly what it sounds like. It is the master. It's the most important node that you've got. That's the one that has not just your object information, but it also has all the other bits of information relating to your cluster as and when you build it. The replica node, which is created if you opt for high availability, that's something we'll cover a little bit later. It's a hot standby, if you will, or a mirror of the master. Nice little option if that's something that you want to protect your master node and you have the resources available to do that. The replica node is there for you. The data node, that's much more common. That's so you've deployed your master node. You know you're going to need 3 or 4 more nodes. Excuse me. Your data node is what will happen after that. And the data node is exactly, again, what it sounds like. It stores data. Everything is generally evenly sharded across the cluster. And the remote collector, again, its name explains exactly what it is. You deploy that on a site. So if you have a site in Singapore, that's your main site, and then your business has sites in London or Sydney or New York, typically you'd put your remote collectors in those sites, and they would then point back to your source in Singapore. So you would not be stretching your cluster across those, even on your LAN, and you'll see why in a little while. So your choices. You've got the option of deploying your virtual appliance. Comes as a single OVA. I mean, anyone that's worked with VMware products now knows what an OVA is. It's a great package. I'm speaking purely from the field here. I'm not a VMware employee, so I suppose I can get away with being a bit more candid. If you can use the virtual appliance, please do. It's going to make your life a lot easier. That doesn't mean you can't use the other options, but I'm going to tell you the virtual appliance has been built in the way that you'd expect. Take, for instance, vCenter VCSA or other virtual appliances that you've come across. The reason that's worth sticking with is because the operating system and everything in there has been tailored purely for that job and that job only. So you know that when you deploy it, that's its job, that's what it does. It's been optimized for that. So you can more or less rule out any nonsense that you may or may get from any third-party operating system, whether it's Linux or Windows. That is the first thing I would recommend. Another thing is get your DNS right. Oh, sorry, go on. Go ahead, mate.
Yeah. No, I actually wanted to add on that to you. I mean, even being a VMware employee, I would say that. So yeah, the virtual appliance is absolutely the first preference to go with. Having said that, and as Simon mentioned, you can go with a Windows-based vROps and a Linux-based vROps as well. Absolutely no problems with that. But to be honest, they were made for very specific use cases. Use cases where when we started with vROps, there was not much hardening options available where you can go ahead and harden things and stuff like that. So for organizations like banks or financial institutes and government, they were worried about following certain hardening guidelines. But what we did was in subsequent versions of vROps, now we have specific hardening document which allows you to go ahead and do that hardening on the virtual appliance as well and make sure that everything is secured as per your standards. So that's where the use case of Windows and Linux was primarily. That was the number one use case. There were customers who said that they prefer their own operating system rather than riding on what VMware gives them. And that's where the second use case comes in. But that's pretty corner cases, to be honest. The biggest one was hardening, being able to control that operating system under the application. But with the latest versions of the virtual appliances and some latest documentation out there, you can actually go ahead and do that hardening on the virtual appliances as well, which is kind of cool. Yeah, that's what I wanted to add to that, Simon.
Yeah, I've seen that come up a few times, and that's really good to know. Like you say, not everybody is too concerned with that, but definitely I know some of my colleagues, they've come across that when they've been with governments or banks. So yeah, that's awesome. Going back to a couple of other tips from the field, then get your DNS right, including your reverse lookup. I cannot stress that enough. And those of you familiar with other VMware things, perhaps like VRA, it's first thing you should be thinking of is DNS. Get it right, get it done first, make sure it's there. It'll just save you a lot of troubleshooting and save some tears in the future. And the other thing to reinforce that is use a naming convention that makes sense to you. So there isn't a prescribed, best practice for this. It really comes down to your naming convention that you may or may not use in your workplace. If you don't have one, maybe now's the time to adopt one. But a naming convention will help you identify what the nodes are, what they're doing. You have to remember that if you have a fairly large site, you need to know what that node is doing, where it's placed, what it's pointing to, and what it's relating to. So that's quite important. All right, we'll move forward here.
Yep. And Simon, I do have some questions. I think we should field them while we are on the topic. So, first question from Andrew is that can you mix Windows, Linux, virtual appliances within a cluster or HA or remote collector? I think the answer to that is no.
I think
whatever you have, from a cluster perspective.
I believe
Yep.
from the cluster point of view, from the cluster point of view, you can't. But you can, I believe, have Windows remote collectors. So you can mix it if it's the remote collectors that are different. But you definitely can't do that in a cluster point of view. And I would sort of urge to be consistent there anyway. But so I'm pretty sure it's supported. So you could have, your cluster as virtual appliance, and then your remote collectors as Windows. That's something I believe is supported.
Yep, absolutely. So another question from Roshan is that regarding remote collector, as Simon said, be used if collecting data outside for LAN. So I think what he's trying to say is that is the remote collector only to be used when it's a LAN connectivity? So the answer is no. You can use it for local WAN as well, so or local connectivity as well, LAN as well as WAN, both.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, I mean we'll cover the remote collectors a little bit more in detail later, but the remote collectors are actually very cool, and you'll see why in a few slides' time. Any other questions?
And one more last one. Yep, there's a last one. I think it's more of a comment that there are some cases where you might need a NIC or an additional NIC on the vROps server, or maybe for backup or some other purposes. But if that's the case, then that's where people bend towards going for Windows or Linux versions rather than the appliance version. I would definitely want to understand the use case of that, but that's one more case.
Okay, so sizing. So what you're seeing here is a cutaway from the sizing spreadsheet. Hardly perhaps the most exciting thing you're ever going to see in your life, but rest assured you are going to need to visit and use this spreadsheet. Now this is the 6.1 version, as you can see clearly from the header. But this spreadsheet is freely available from the VMware site. In fact, all of them are available, so 6.0, 6.1, and 6.2. And I would imagine that will be the trend going forward. You need to come to this spreadsheet and essentially put in your figures. You've got two options for doing this. You can do it in a basic format where you simply just give it the number of hosts, the number of expected VMs, I think, and one other. And it just gives you a rough output of the number of nodes and the size of those nodes that you will need to cover your environment based on the figures you have put into it. Or you can go to the Advanced tab and put in more granular figures if you want to be a little more precise. But I cannot stress enough, guys, you need to use this spreadsheet. It will give you, even if it's not right down accurate in terms of, no one knows precisely how many objects they have or how many metrics they're going to cover, but if you use this spreadsheet and then factor in a little bit of growth, this will save you some tears. So you're going to want to use this. So as the Homer image there says, spreadsheet, it's not necessarily exciting, but it will save you a lot of pain. And it's only a 5 or a 10 minute job to do so. I put in a tiny
not
URL
really.
link there.
I was saying, not really, Simon. I mean, 5-10 minutes if you want to do a basic first level check in terms of what you need. Let's say when you're trying to estimate things, but when you really want to go down and do the architecture design, especially for some of those tricky situations or bigger environments, you might want to spend some more time there on that document. Actually, there were questions around that, Simon, at the previous slide. So that's why I interrupted as well before you jumped into that
we can go back.
With that.
Yeah, let's.
Yeah. So I think Roshan asked a question that the medium node is 5,000 or 7,000. So I think he has worked on the calculator before, because because the 5,000 he mentions is actually a capacity of medium node, which is in a multi-node scenario. So what you see, Roshan, on the screen in the single node maximum object is 7,000 for medium. But if you take a multi-node maximum objects, then that will be 5,000. And that is what I believe Simon will show you in the calculator as well. And
I'm not going to demonstrate the spreadsheet today. But I gave the link on the next page. No, I'm not going to demonstrate that. That'll be death by spreadsheet. I don't want to do that.
Okay, we will see. So let's say if we get some time and there are more questions around that spreadsheet, then probably at the end of the session, we'll see if we have time and I can bring it up for the benefit of everyone. Yeah. Okay. One more thing, I think that there's another question from Joe, is that how can I get the count of objects inside a vROps deployment? I can take that. So if you're already running a vROps deployment, then it's very, very simple. You just need to go and get the audit report from the vROps deployment under the administration tab. And you will basically have an audit menu where you can get the audit report, and that tells you all the objects and metrics which you're collecting. Hope that answers the question, Joe.
There is something you can see live as well without running the audit. Under, I think it's cluster management in the same area. It'll list all of the nodes, and you will see the number of objects per node as well as metrics. And that's sort of up to the minute. So that helps. Another way of identifying it. While it's not a report per se, you can actually see how many objects each node is handling. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so maximums and scalability. So if anyone is used to old VMware exams where configuration maximums were quite popular, this should be familiar. So we're now on 6.2. I think it was 6.1 where they increased the maximum nodes from 8 to 16. So there you go. You can go up to 16 nodes in a cluster. That's seriously large. I've done some extremely large deployments and I haven't yet got to 16 nodes. So bear in mind what I mean by 16 nodes. I'm talking 16 large nodes, which, when you look at the size of a large node, that would be a serious amount of compute allocated to vROPs if you went to that scale. But that's 16 of any of the nodes, so that can be small, medium, or large. But again, always follow the spreadsheet, because that's going to dictate what is supported and what is not. But we'll cover what happens if you do make a mistake or an error in your calculations for whatever reason. Maximum supported number of remote collectors is 50. So if you have a lot of remote sites, which some people do, they have lots of remote offices, small offices. 50 should look after you quite well. And the same here with the vCenter adapter instance is 50. That may sound a lot. I have worked with clients where we have they have more than that in their estate. So yeah, 50 is a lot, but I've seen customers with that and more. Now this is important. Concurrent users per node. Now this is supported, and it's irrespective of node size. Now, where did the number 4 come from? Now, Sonny will probably jump in here as well. As I understand it, the number 4 is particular to the number of users with admin credentials. Now, I don't know if this is documented anywhere. I'm purely giving you my experience with it. So don't go running off to VMware and saying, Simon told me this and that. Please make it supported. I'm going to tell you my experience now. So this is the disclaimer. So the number 4 there is particular around the number of users who have admin permissions. And that's important to remember, because when you're logged in as admin, you can do all things to all men in your cluster. If you were to reduce the permissions of the users, so let's hypothetically say you have guys with just read-only access who are part of a NOC team, and you have 20 guys, then yeah, I would say that should be okay. You really need to dialogue with VMware on this, though, if you want to use different numbers of people accessing it. But I'll let Sonny jump in now.
I was eager to jump in. No, I completely agree to what you said, Simon. So, yeah, the definition might not be just the admin user, but we need to remember this, right? When you bring up the vROps UI has multiple different menus and options, and let's say if you have 100 dashboards, you open them at some point of time, then they also all populate up. So to build all that with a good experience to the user within a good amount of time or less time, you need to build and populate all that data from the databases and the Gemfire caching layer, etc., back to the UI, right? And if I'm saying that all of this is being seen by 4 users, then 4 is the number where you will get optimum performance. If you have a 5th user or a 6th or a 20th user logging in, it doesn't mean that he'll not be able to log in. It's just that the performance will keep degrading from an experience perspective. However, as Simon mentioned, if let's say you have 20 users and each user has just only one dashboard permission to look at a particular dashboard because you shared it to that user or that business group, etc., and it's just one view which they are seeing, then that will not be counted as equivalent to that one user which you see over here. So that number 4 is typically a guidance, but it's very difficult to go ahead and do sizing or going beyond that number 4 and explaining those 100,000 different combinations which could happen in the field or in the customer places. So yeah, that's where the guidance comes from.
Absolutely. If in doubt, speak to VMware is really the thing there. But just don't expect to have super duper performance if you have 20 or 50 people logging on with admin. Things are just not going to end well for you. Okay.
Yep. So Carl does has a scientific explanation for that with numbers, and he's shared that with everyone on the chat window. So feel free to go through that. And thanks, Carl. Yep.
Yeah, thank you, Carl.
Thanks, Carl, for chipping in. I'll get that for you, Simon.
Okay, thank you. So
all right.
Let's talk about HA very quickly and how that affects your maximum. So if you enable HA, you're essentially, the best way to approach it is if you're halving the capacity of your cluster, because you are essentially creating a mirror of the data. So that's the best way to look at it, which is why, when we get to it in a moment, why there's discussion around whether you should or shouldn't use HA. But those are the metrics, the supported metrics, or rather the maximums that you have when you have HA enabled and when it's not enabled. And the thing at the bottom there, all the nodes in a cluster must be the same. So you cannot chop and change, guys. So don't even try. If you do and you call GSS, you will not be supported, essentially. And you don't want to be in that place. All right, so a little bit more technical here. These are different ways of deploying vROPs. As you can see, these are two examples of how you can do it right. So if you look there, you have your vROPs on the left-hand panel here. Let's get a little marker, perhaps, a little highlighter. So here, this is in one data center, so that's on the same LAN, same logical data center. Your vROPs nodes are all inside there, and your remote collectors are elsewhere. You can see geographically they're in different locations. This is good. This is also good, as you can see. Everything is inside this one location, even though the VLAN is across two logical or physical data centers, and your remote collectors are a thing. I can't stress this enough. Do not stretch your vROPs nodes, even if it's on the same LAN or the same subnet, across geographical zones. It's not supported. And do not do it across logical data centers. So if you've got your vCenter and you've got 2, 3, 5 logical data centers, and you put the nodes in different areas, it is not supported. And generally, it will not work. So just save yourself the pain and understand this now. So if I jump to the next slide. So there we go. Do this. Do not do this. So you can see here the cluster's bridged across two geographical zones. That's no good. And the same here. They're doing the same where they've bridged it across the two. Just don't do this, guys. It's not going to work. You might get it working briefly, or you may think that your network's super fast, or you may have other reasons why you think you want to do this. It's not supported, guys. If you're not sure, just speak to someone at VMware. Or a good place to ask questions actually is Twitter with the hashtag vROPs. You're not sure, post a question. Can I do this? There's lots of people out there in the vExpert and VMware community who would be very happy to tell you either what's supported or the best place to go to find out more about it. But these mistakes, I've not seen people make this mistake too much because it's fairly well documented what you should and shouldn't do. But as this is all about design considerations, these are things you should and shouldn't do. All right, so high availability. Should you or shouldn't you? Now, it provides tolerance for a single node failure. It protects your master node. So a good case for this is your master node contains all that valuable information about the cluster. So not only does it contain the sharded information about your environment, it also contains all the information about your cluster, about the different nodes. So if you do lose your master node, it's game over for your cluster. So if you have an 8-node vROPs cluster and your master node goes the way of the dodo, unless you've got a backup of it, that's it. It's game over, guys. So there's a compelling business case for using high availability. The thing to remember is the remote collectors are not impacted, although to be honest, the remote collectors are to a penny, as it were. So if you lose one, just deploy another one. It's far better to just replace it than try and back it up. They're generally instanceless. They don't retain any configuration. I've seen a couple of situations where it does, but that's another thing. But generally, your remote collectors, you don't need to worry about protecting them. But going back to HA, if you're going to deploy it, what you do is you have a master node, you then deploy the next node, which will be in a data mode, and then you can change it to be the replica, a master replica, as it were. It takes a little while for it to kick in, but once it's in sync, it's then a hot standby of the master. Definitely, as you can see at the bottom there, keep them separated on different data stores and different hosts. So, if you lose a host or you lose a LUN, you're protected. What are the cons for it? Well, if you have a fairly large environment and you don't have massive amounts of compute available, it might not be an option for you to enable HA because you're then halving the capacity of your vROps cluster. So if your 8-node cluster can handle 75,000 objects and your environment has, let's say, 60,000, and you opt for HA and that reduces it to 40,000, and you don't have the compute to stretch beyond that, then there you go. You can't really go for HA. But if you can afford the compute and you definitely want to use HA, then yeah, why not? It's good to protect that master node if you can. But I'm certainly not going to go out there and tell you must use it all the time, because there's impact and considerations around the amount of compute that you will have to use and provision. And the bottom line is, the bigger you get, the more of an impact that will have for you on your management or tools or resource clusters. So those are things to think about. Any questions on that before we move forward?
Yeah, I do have questions on the screen, and I do have comments on the slide as well to add to what Simon just mentioned. So I'll probably do my comments and then quickly jump to those questions. So one thing which is important to understand from HA or not HA perspective is that how critical vROps becomes in your infrastructure. So to be honest, when I started with vROps or starting doing consulting around it and started with customers who had small environments and then medium environments and so on and so forth, and they were just monitoring it and using vROps with some cool dashboards and stuff, things were okay. They were not really worried about HA because they could back up the nodes and restore them. And dashboards can wait, or a report can wait for a couple of days if they have to spend that much time to go ahead and restore the nodes. But situations where they put, for instance, the alerting mechanisms or their operations, day-to-day operations based on the alerts coming in from vROps, or let's say if they are using service ticket generation through third-party integrations and so on and so forth, then is when it becomes critical, because then that's the only single source of truth for them to understand how the infrastructure is running and how their workloads are performing, and if there are any events going on there which can cause business downtimes. So as soon as you move into that zone is when you would start thinking about that what will happen if my vROps instance is down. I will be literally, and one of my customers says, I literally feel like flying blind if the vROps is down. So just copying his words here on this session, we need to ensure that we use HA wherever we think we are going to land into such a situation where vROps would become the central, I'll not call it single pane of glass, but the centralized go-to place to find out what's going on, either from capacity, performance, events, incidents, problems, everything. So that's how I like to tie the story up.
Yeah, I think leading on from that, I recently, a few months ago, I did a blog article on vROps being the new diva in the data center. vROps being what it is, and it's now how scalable it is and how big it can get, and the information that it contains and how important your organization can rely on that. You need to treat vROps, certainly once you've got it going and you're happy with it and it's becoming that single point of reference. It's a tier 1 application. So you need to think about it. And I know some people will be like, what? But it really is a demanding piece of software in terms of what it needs to do its job well. And once you're used to that and it's giving you all that really great information and you're optimizing your environment and therefore, dare I say it, making savings because of that, it's a critical app and therefore should be treated as such. Don't treat it like, perhaps your legacy monitoring software, which may not have been a big or perhaps used in the same way. You need to really consider how important it is for your business and what financial impact it will have in terms of it giving you all that information about resizing things and getting capacity back, all those kinds of things. But then the flip side to that, more critically, is all the alerting that it gives you, the predictions, capacity planning, all of that. So it is a critical application in your environment.
Yep.
So treat it as such.
Great.
All right.
Yep. So Simon, let me take those questions.
Yeah, sure.
These are some really good questions out there. So the one from Roshan says that if master fails, replica will take over as master. But what happens if a data node fails? You want me to answer that?
Yeah, you go for that one, mate.
Okay. So as Simon mentioned, right, the master and the master replica is basically to share the responsibilities of what master does over and above the data nodes, right, which is the sharding as well as the custom configurations and so on and so forth. Apart from that, if you look at a HA cluster, and as soon as you put or enable HA, what happens is that as soon as you're writing data or to vROps, it gets written in two locations, right? So any data collected or any metric being computed gets written into two locations. So let's say if you have master, replica, data 1, data 2, and something comes in and saves into data 1, then it will automatically make another copy of it in data 2 or in master or in replica. Now that's how the analytics engine works once you, and the Gemfire works once you enable HA. So it's an application RAID, which basically is also called RAIN, and which ensures that even if you lose one data node, you will still have data. And that's why the slide says over here that it's a single node failure in an analytic cluster. So that's what Simon highlighted here. So at any given point of time, you can, whether it's master or any other node, you can go up to one node failure. I will let you take the next one, Simon, which is in a small infra, having master node backup can help to bring back to normal state, or you only need HA. I think we answered that one.
I didn't quite catch the question. I'm sorry.
Yeah, so I think the question from Vivek was that do you actually need HA, or can backup restore be another option
for a single node?
Restore,
Is it?
I think it's for a cluster because he's talking about HA, and that doesn't apply to a single node. Yep. Okay. Yep. So I think the answer I have already given to that, Vivek. It depends on your requirements and your recover time objective of vROps. And if it's critical, then you need HA. If it's not, then you can go with a backup restore. Another question from Tas is that does the current log insight content pack for vROps have ability to monitor all critical logs? And I believe he's talking about critical services as well in terms of CASA, analytics, admin UI, collector, etc., or dashboard. So Tas, the answer to that is yes. the latest vROps management pack or content pack for login site has built-in alerts in that content pack, so which you can enable, and you can send them as emails or webhooks, or you can forward them to vROps itself, and you will be able to know if your vROps services are playing up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I'm getting mindful of the time at the moment, so what I think we'll do is we'll move forward now a few slides before we take any more questions, guys, because I'm a little constrained by time today myself. So we'll try and save the questions perhaps towards the end of the session now, unless there's a really burning question. Okay.
Sure. Let's go ahead.
Okay, so clustering. Very simple diagram, but very clear and distinct. You can see how everything is broken down, where the data resides, and the roles. As you can see clearly, you can have a load balancer, and that will help with your the question earlier about how many people can access. And if you want to balance that out, a load balancer is supported. So bear that in mind if you're going to use it for a NOC or a large support environment. A load balancer is a great way of spreading the access of admins or engineers across your cluster. And you can see there where the remote collector fits in and its role and what it does. But we won't linger too long on there, but that's a great image there. Okay,
Yep.
so what if you get it wrong? So, no one's perfect. We're all going to make mistakes. You don't want to be wasting your time if you can help it. Everybody's pushed. There is going to be the case where you may have sized it wrong, or maybe you didn't know about the spreadsheet. You did it wrong, or let's say you did it right, but the environment, suddenly the company you're working for has just acquired another company, and you need to scale out. Yes, you can, essentially. So let's take into consideration that you undersized it. Let's say you deployed maybe one or two small nodes, and you really should have gone medium. Yes, you can scale it up. The way to do that really is to take the cluster offline. I can't stress that enough, by the way, guys. Take the cluster offline before you do anything else, and you can do that from the admin panel in vROps. Take the cluster offline, shut the nodes down, look at the sizing spreadsheet for the number of vCPU and RAM, and as well as disk, and you can size them up automatically. vROps is quite clever enough to figure out what it needs to do. So if you give it the extra CPU, which would then equate to medium size, you can also grow the disk. vROps has a little tool built into it where it picks up the extra disk space that you've given it, and it'll resize it, and then off you go. So not too painful. So that takes into account if you've really undersized it. If you hit the situation where you just need to scale out, well, it's very simple. You deploy the node that you want at the size that you want to match your existing. So say if you've got a four node medium size cluster, you can just deploy a fifth node, medium size, and during the deployment process, you can add to an existing cluster, and it just adds it in, does all the work for you, and it'll tell you when it's complete. So very, very painless. Really great design. I give it a big thumbs up to VMware. They could not have made that any less painless. It's brilliant. It works really well. So those are two things there about how you can handle the sizing. So the bottom line here, really, guys, is if you get it wrong, it's not a crisis. Yeah, if you've completely undersized it and you want to just burn it down and start again, and you don't need to retain the data that you've got, that's fine too. But
12:30 शुरू होनी थी, शुरू हो रखी है पहले से ही. नहीं सर, ये देखो जो मीटिंग इनवाइट आया है वो 12:30 से शुरू होगी.
I think somebody is speaking.
Yeah.
Okay.
7 मिनट पे
Give me a second.
आधी खत्म हो गई है. पता कहाँ से रहेगा क्या हो रहा है.
I'm not able to find out who that is, so let me mute everybody.
Okay.
Okay, I think the person is muted now. Go ahead.
Okay. Okay, so we'll move on. Remote collectors. Okay, guys, this is some cool stuff. So as we know, the remote collectors, by name and definition, they can be placed on your remote sites, and they can go ahead and grab the data from those sites. A couple of things to remember is they don't provide access to the UE. So if you're on the remote site and you try and point a web browser to the remote collector, you're not going to get the vROps dashboards or anything like that. So that's not going to work. The remote collectors, you can't traverse a NAT. You need a proper WAN. The communication is bidirectional, not just one way. So that's not supported and it won't work. Network connection loss between the remote collectors, you know, it can tolerate a little bit, but it's not going to go well for you after about 2 minutes. But, you know, I think typically with people's reliable WAN connections, unless you've got something really horrendous, you should be okay. I'm going to move swiftly on to the next case because this is more important about the use cases for them. So, as I've said already, it's all about geographical locations and where you place them. So if you've got your cluster in your reliable main data center or central location, that's where you should be putting your cluster. Your remote collectors can be off on your home offices or your small offices or remote locations around the globe. Another use case for them is if you have parts of your network that are firewalled off for reasons, whatever they may be. Because the number of ports that remote collectors require, they're excellent for that. They don't need much to get through, so your security or firewall team will be happy with that. It's only a couple of ports that you need. It'll open them up, the data's there, and you're able to get access and report on those secure or whatever they are environments inside your DMZs or behind different firewalls. A third use case here, and this is kind of one of the cool things about it, is just because it says remote collector doesn't mean you can't use it locally. Now, the reason for that is, you can see the example there with regards to Horizon, but I'll just give this in general speak. If you have a fairly large environment, you can use the remote collectors to offload all of that collection process. So typically you can have your cluster collecting data, but if you want to offload that work, I think we've got someone else talking on the call.
Troubleshooting VMware, troubleshooting vMotion.
Yeah, let me just mute.
VMware troubleshooting.
Mute off. Wow. Okay.
Okay. Sorry, going back to that. So your cluster can do the job of the remote collectors locally. So if you have your 4-node cluster in your data center, and it can collect everything to it. But if you want to offload that work so that your cluster is just doing the analytics and doing the dashboards and everything else, then you can put remote collectors local to that in the same LAN or the same physical location. It'll offload all of that collection work, and you can have the remote collectors doing that, and you can group them up as well. So those are some use cases there. I don't know if you want to jump in there, Sonny, at all, or we'll move on.
I'll take a quick minute there. So you've got a great use case of remote collector out there. I mean, I've used it for a customer who was facing issues, and they don't want to go ahead and upsize their existing environment because they want to collect large number of objects. So it's only from a collection standpoint, and remote collector is a great use case. And yes, one more important thing, as Carl mentioned, that if you're putting it on a remote collector, it doesn't mean that you're not giving the cool HA features to a particular adapter, like a vCenter adapter, for instance. With 6.1 onwards, you can actually group remote collectors in a remote collector group, and they can work in a HA mode as well. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah, that works really well as well. It's a nice feature from 6.1. Good point.
Yeah,
Okay.
and one thing which I have seen is one thing which I've known from engineering and have been talking to them internally is that some of the times if you really want to go ahead and increase the capacity of that node remote collector, so let's say for a few more thousand or tens of thousands of metrics, then you have the opportunity to increase the memory size for that remote collector. And that will give you that some additional buffer for collecting more metrics. So that's probably the field.
Yeah, you have two different remote collector sizes, which are standard and large. Large is large. So if you find that remote collector needs to be sized up, you can do so.
Yep.
All right.
Yep.
So backing up, this is quite important. It's a question that comes up quite a bit, because obviously as it becomes your critical app in your environment, you're going to want to back this thing up. The first thing on the list there, as you can see, disable QSing. Can't stress that enough. You need to make sure that what you're reading there, I'm not going to read this out, and I'm kind of mindful of the time. These are the things that you need to bear in mind when you're backing up vROPs. So you can see some of them are quite constrained, especially if you have quite a large cluster. The time difference between all the nodes, you must back them all up at the same time. So these are all very important things. If you back the nodes up at separate times, it is not going to go well for you. So that's absolutely critical. You can't deploy agents onto these things, especially on the virtual appliance. So if you depending on your backup tools, so hence at the top there, it's going to be backed up by a VADP compatible backup application, snapshot based. So you're not going to be just backing up little bits of it inside it. It's not going to work. I kind of want to skip over this and get to the questions at the end, really. You don't need to stop the cluster while you're performing the backup, by the way. I'm trying to think if there's anything else that comes up, but not really. I think that covers the backups. Restoring, it must be full, not partial. You can see all the various steps there. These are things you must do. And it's important in any environment that you do test this stuff from time to time. I know that's for some people it's like, who tests their backups? Well, you should, and with vROPs, if it becomes critical, you should test this. Of course, I understand, for some people that may be capacity issues, but you want to test your backups. So follow the restore options here and make sure that it comes up and that it's working for you. You really don't want to be in the position where you think you're taking backups, everything seems to be good, but you've never actually done a test restore. You should be doing that, guys, but I'm not going to beat you all over the head about that. Okay, let's move on. Your environment. Okay, so everybody's environment is different, but these are the things that your environment has to support. So while everybody's environment is different, you might have 10 gig and 40 gig and all sorts of other funky things. These are the things that you must have for vROPs to be working in your environment. Again, I'm not going to read all of this out. When it comes to deploying, you can see use ego-thick provisioning. That's even on Flash, by the way, guys. Obviously, ego-thick is in one sense, some people are like, well, why? But it's all about the first writing, and it does have an impact. So if you've forgotten to do that, it's not a crisis, but that's something that they prefer. Storage latency, quite low. Things to consider in terms of design, your storage on the spreadsheet. It'll tell you the number of IOPS that your cluster is going to consume. And it will do that. Initially, it won't. So if it's a new deployment, it definitely won't consume the maximum number of IOPS that you see listed on the spreadsheet. But as it grows and it gets busy and the number of objects and metrics it collects is more, then those IOPS will start to really kick in. So make sure you have good storage. As you can see, the storage latency there, 10 to 15 milliseconds. So you need good quality storage, whether it's flash cached or all flash or fast spinning disks. Those are things to take into account. Use DRS, guys. So if I'm assuming everybody is comfortable with using DRS, and I hope you're using it in an automatic fashion. Yeah, sure, some people still don't trust it. Personally, I don't understand why you don't trust it, but you should. Leverage the anti-affinity rules where possible. You don't want the vROps nodes cohabiting on hosts. If you have really, really big hosts with lots of CPU, lots of RAM, you could probably get away with it. But you have to bear in mind that if you lose that host for whatever reason, then if you've got just one node on there, it's not so bad. If you've got 2 or more nodes on that host, then yeah, it's not so great for you. The thing to realize and understand is vROps is quite a hungry beast. There are best practices. I forget the reference architecture that's made available now by VMware about the best way to deploy vROps in relation to CPU, whether it should be one-to-one, which typically you want to think about that with large nodes because of the number of vCPUs and the amount of RAM required. So there are lots of things you need to think about, guys, when it comes to, so if you're on small or medium, maybe not so critical, but if you start getting into the realms of large nodes, you absolutely need to make sure you've got the resources and that you've got them separated out. You need to look after it. And as I put at the bottom there, your vROps is a tier 1 application. So look after it and give it the hardware it deserves. I don't think you've got anything to add there, Sunny.
I just want to say that the amount of beeping which I've heard in the past few minutes, it's crazy. I think we're going towards the end of our session, and I see people joining in. I don't know if it's a cross connection, but I love it. I mean, I could see thousands of people joining in. All right, guys, this is not a lotto or a lottery competition for sure. This is about vROps design. But yeah.
Hello.
Yeah, is there a question?
Sunny, actually, we got an invite that this training session would start at 12:30. So I think this is the reason that a lot of people are joining in.
Ah, okay. All right. So I think
it's over now.
Nothing is over in life. The good news is that this is recorded. So, and this recording would be posted on my Twitter as well as my blog and Simon's blog. So what I'll do is probably, Simon, I'll take a minute at the end of this session, once you finish the slides, to show people where the recordings are so that the ones who've joined late are not disappointed when they can get through this session and the previous sessions and the trainings without any issue.
Yeah, that'd be great. I'm going to need to disappear in a few minutes because I have to do, it's 8 o'clock in the morning here, and I need to do a few housekeeping things here at home. But I put a link there to the reference architecture. Use tinyURL. If you want a point of reference, guys, if you're going to be deploying or you will be deploying or have deployed and you want to see if you've done it right or close to it, go to that link, have a look at it, read it. It'll tell you, the best way. I'm not so keen on using the word best practice, but that's great information in that documentation about how you should deploy vROps and the best way to use it, and how to get the best out of it. But I'm going to need to jump off the call in a second, Sunny.
Okay, no worries. I will take presenter rights, and I will probably go ahead and share the previous recordings. Thank you, Simon. Thank you for your wonderful session and partnership. And I'll see you around in the next session